All right, so my name is Burt Beckwith. I see a lot of familiar faces, so I'm not going to do the whole introduction. I work for SpringSource on the Grails team, and I've done most of the Spring Security plugins. The interesting thing about the plugins is that I created the core plugin, and I designed it in a way that it would be a small core, because the CG plugin had gotten really bloated. And so what I wanted was something that was more modular. So I designed a plugin that basically takes plugins. And the amazing thing that happened was that I didn't document anything about that. And people extended my plugin, and they added other plugins. Like there's a Facebook plugin that I was going to write that someone wrote for me. And so I was like, well, that's great. So I've written most of the plugins. I've written 7 or 8 of the security plugins, and there's 3 or 4 or 5 more that other people have also done. Along the same lines as the earlier talk from this morning, one of the things that I think is under-documented and not understood well enough is how do you test security? How do you know that your application is secure enough, that what you think you are guarding is actually guarded? When I do a new release of one or more of the plugins, I have a script that I have. It's mostly a bash script and some Groovy and some Gantt. It's a kind of a mishmash. And what it does is it programmatically creates applications, and then it installs the unreleased plugin into the application, and then I can run functional tests. So it's all scripted, and it takes a very long time to run, but you just let it run. And then I create for every minor version of Grails that I support, I create a version. So I no longer support 1.3, but when I did, I would create a 1.3.7 app and a 2.0.4 app and a 2.1.1 app and a 2.2.0 and so I create one of each, and then I have to run 5 sets of tests for each application. So it takes forever. So I was thinking that it would be interesting to sort of pull a lot of that out into some stuff that you guys could take and use. And I don't want to imply at all that I think that these are best practices or the only way to do this. And in fact, I will ask you more questions than I expect you're going to ask me, because I want to know, what are you already doing? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Because to be honest, I was talking about this earlier, I don't write applications anymore, right? I mean, I write plugins, and I don't get to live in the real world. So I'm a little out of touch with reality and what it takes to actually have an application in production and be nervous that you're going to get hacked and things like that. So, but you guys are right out there, so I want to learn as much from you, hopefully, as you're going to learn from the talk. So there are 3 types of tests in Grails, right? There are unit tests, integration tests. Those you get for free without doing anything. And if you install a functional test plugin, then you get functional tests as the 3rd type of tests. I cannot really think of any sensible unit tests for security. Now, I was going to just stop there, but then I was thinking, well, you could probably do it. Because when you create a controller test, either a unit test or a integration test, you have a mock response and a mock request, right? Those are Grails classes, but they're actually just small wrappers around the Spring classes they implement the interface, and they have fake data. And the request will give you a mock session that has a backing map. The response, actually, you can write to an output stream, and it'll write to a byte array. So it behaves very much like a real request and response in session. And the problem is that Spring Security is implemented as a filter chain, right? So there's one filter in WebXML, and that really nests several filters in the filter chain, and then you can configure those as Spring beans. So if there's no web server, there's no filter chain running, there's nothing that's going to advance the chain, right? But there's a mock filter chain, or there's a filter chain class that represents this. So I was thinking, well, you could do that, I guess. But I still don't think that it would make sense, because you would have to parse the WebXML, you'd have to put all the Grails filters in there, you'd have to put every filter that really is in your WebXML. It would be brittle. I don't think it would maintain well. So it would be theoretically possible to do some of this, a lot of this maybe, with unit tests. If any of you are doing that now or come up with ways to do it, I would love to hear about that. But I think for the most part, most of the tests really have to be functional tests. But can we do this with integration tests, right? Because we want everything to be a unit test. Unit tests are fast. I can run them from my IDE. If tests are slow, they're not going to get run. And I have worked in organizations where the tests took forever to run, they were a real pain, and we just didn't run them. And we let our CI server run our tests for us, and then we would get emails saying we broke the build, and then that happened so often that we stopped caring that the build was broken, and that is so bad because, well, I don't have to tell you that, that's terrible. So can we do this with integration tests? No, because Spring Security is implemented as a filter chain and there's no web server. So yes, you do get a mock request and a mock response. And there is available to you a class that represents the filter chain, but there's still nothing that would advance that chain. Nothing that would start at the first one, call your first filter. When you call the doFilter method after you've done your work, there's nothing that would advance it to know which one's next and advance to that. So there are uses for integration tests. We'll see some. Primarily, I think, for testing services. So if you have annotated services, especially with ACLs, both Shiro or Spring Security, I think you could do a tremendous amount of testing there as integration tests. So integration tests are still slower than unit tests, but they're not quite as slow as functional tests. So I think it's maybe a happy middle ground. So you want to think of integration tests really, I think we misuse the word integration. When I think of an integration test, I think of integrating things, right? Testing that this plugs together with this and they work together correctly. But that's not really how Grails defines an integration test. Really, an integration test is just unit tests with a running DB, by default an in-memory database, but you can switch that out to a test server. And you've got Spring wired up, you've got Hibernate if that's installed, or you've got Redis or whatever you're using, and you've got plugins. You basically have everything but a container. So Spring Security will have configured itself. All the plugins will be there, so you can test the configuration. You can check your URL guarding rules. So if you've annotated your controllers, or if you use request maps or whatever, you have a mapping of this URL pattern is guarded by these roles or these permissions or whatever. So you can test that's appropriately configured. But I don't, and of course, like I said, you can do the ACL testing, and we'll see some examples of that. So we have to do functional tests, and I think the answer is yes, and deal with it. I apologize. So let's talk about functional testing. I think it's really ideal for security testing because you are actually making requests against a properly configured web server. Now, it isn't your production server, so you need to be aware that when you're running your tests, you wouldn't want to test against production. That would be bad. But you want to test in an environment that's as close to production as possible. I'm not going to talk about testing in the abstract because I think you probably know about that. But we can test authentication and authorization. We can test the configuration. We can test everything. So there are a handful of functional test plugins. I use the old functional test plugin. You should be using Jeb. I'm old and change slowly, so I haven't switched to Jeb yet. But I know that Jeb is awesome, and I just haven't played with it enough that I can really talk about it in this talk. But it really is ideal. It fires up a browser and you make requests against it, and you can test AJAX. And most of the stuff that I do, though, doesn't need that sort of a browser-based test. All I really need is to do a get or a post, get the response back, and just parse that response and assert that that I got a 403 error, or I got a 404 error, or I got I got the appropriate data, or I got a message that said you are not allowed to see this, or something like that, right? So I don't really at this point think that I really need something like Jeb, but it's definitely the way to go. So the way that it works is that it uses Apache Commons HTTP client to programmatically create those requests and do a get or a post. Then it uses HTML unit to parse the response into a DOM so that you can inspect it. It is, and I apologize for that, it uses JUnit 3, which is really old school. Told you I'm old. But this isn't my plugin, so I take no responsibility for that. But basically what you do is you extend a base class and you take advantage of all the underlying functionality in that base class. There is a 2.0 version of the plugin in development that has been very much modernized. It's a lot better. It has an RC in the name. It's apparently a release candidate. I don't know what the state of it is, so I haven't switched to using it yet. I'm still using 1.2.7. Works great for me, except for one thing. Never, ever, 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 ever run the create functional test script, which is in the documentation for how you get started, right? So you want to have something that creates your test scripts that you then flesh out. If you do that, it will erase your config.groovy, build config, data source.groovy. It'll reset them back to the original versions from when you originally said Grails create app name. If you've got source control, then you're good because you can just revert those changes. But if you're in the middle of sort of playing around with a new thing, then this will piss you off. So it doesn't do much, so it's easy to do what that script should have done. That's fixed in the 2.0 version, but like I said, I'm still using the old one. So the way that you use it is we don't use install plugin anymore, right? Nobody here uses install plugin because we know that that's wrong. We use build config and we set dependencies in build config. You want this to be test scoped? You just give it the name and the version. Now this will fail the first time. It'll look like it failed. You get a weird XML error. You'll get this big ugly gargoyle software thing. I just know to expect this error and that it's ignorable. You just run Grails compile one more time and it'll finish the resolving and everything will be good. If it continues to fail, you have a real problem, but you should expect to see this error. It's not a problem at all. And I just want to say this one more time. Never, ever, 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 ever run create functional test. You've been warned if you do this. I'm on videotape telling you not to do this. So all you need to do is create a class that extends functional test plugin.functional test case. So just copy and paste this, right? This is all that it does. It has a template that creates this file, and it replaces the word if you say create functional test foo, it'll create a foo tests. So just do exactly this, right? That's not hard. Copy paste is the same thing. And then look to the documentation for the plugin for what to do. And if you look at the commented out stuff, you can see what you do. You literally just it's like a DSL. You say get URI, and it actually makes a request. So functional tests start up a running server. So from your JVM, it will call into the other JVM on port 8080 or whatever you're running on, and it will get that. You can post, you can submit forms, you can click links, you can do all that stuff. And then you've got these convenience methods like assert status, assert content contains, things like that. So those are all methods that are right there in the base class. And it would be very easy, I think, to convert this base class into a Spock base class, a spec, so that you could use Spock tests for this. Because there's no reason to use JUnit 3 other than that's how it works. So how do you know what to test? What URLs to test? You should have a sitemap of your application, but you may not. I came up with a very small, a few lines of code that will. This doesn't find all the URLs in your application. It finds all the controller actions in your application. So what we really want to do is reverse engineer the URL mappings, right? And find out all the callable URLs, but that would be potentially infinite based on patterns and regular expressions and things. So what this does is it basically loops through all the controller classes in the Grails application and finds all the methods. And there's an AST that runs in 2.0 and above that adds in an @action, the Grails web action, annotation to every public method in your controller. And also, if you're still using closures in your controllers, it will actually create a method with the same name, annotate that, and then instead of calling the closure, it calls your method. The method calls your closure. So you don't have to worry about the difference between closures and methods. This code will find everything that's callable from your controller. And it just creates a map with some data. So for the test application I'm going to show you, this is what that would show. So I've got a book controller, an errors controller, login controller. These two come from the Spring Security plugin, so those don't really need testing, right? The logo controller, you're not going to test that. This is the big one we're going to test. Book controller also, and then errors controller is kind of a convenience thing. So this is what it's going to show. So, and actually the login controller, because I still support 1.3 for the core plugin, those are actually all closures. So it finds closures and actions. So. All right, so that's the end of my slides. And now I'm going to do a demo. Is there something I could, like a stand for the microphone? Maybe I'll just talk really loud. So what I'm going to do is something that's new for me. Cedric did something like this earlier. Basically, I don't want to copy paste code, and I don't want you to have to sit there and watch me type. So what I did was I created an application. And I did something I've never done before. Groovy is a scripting language, right? I've never written a Groovy script. I used bash scripts when I was a Windows person back before I saw the light. I wrote batch scripts. I've never used Groovy except in Grails and for very small things that I would except for things that I would throw away. But Groovy is a scripting language. It's for writing scripts. So I wrote a Groovy script, made it executable, and in a Linux or Unix environment, you can make it runnable like this, right? Just like a bash script. And I'm not going to go through the details of this. I'll do a blog post on this. But basically what I'm going to do is I went through and I created an application, and then I put it aside, and I built it again. And then every important step, I did a check-in, a commit into Git. And the way Cedric did his was he tagged each check-in, so he'd know which one to do. What I do instead, though, is I have a little script that runs in and gets all the commits and writes it to a little text file. And I have this script called step. And every time I run it, it advances me one ahead. So you don't have to watch me copy and paste. So the application will keep changing as I go. And I'm not actually going to type anything. So this should go pretty quickly. So the first one is just a basic Grails app that has the little stuff that I do to clean up the cruft that Grails creates by default. And then I run it again, and it steps me ahead one, and I can, if I do a git log-n1, it'll give me my last commit statement. So my first commit was that I created a book class and a credit card domain class. So let me show you those. Thank you. Thanks. All right. So I have a book class and a credit card class. Right. So it has a username. Pretty basic credit card class, right? All right. I'm going to do this. Then I step ahead one and generate the controller for that, and it generates a unit test, and I got that running as a unit test. Then I installed the security plugins, and I did the initial S2 quick start script. Show of hands, who uses Spring Security Core plugin? So a lot of you don't know what I'm talking about. There's a very basic configuration you need to do to get your user and role class going. So I've run this at this point. So now I have a user class and a role class and a join class for the many-to-many. There's also a permission class for the Spring Security Shiro plugin, which I'm using for ACLs. So I'm going to use both Spring Security ACLs and Shiro ACLs. And I'll put this up on GitHub, and I'll put the instructions on how to do all this stuff, and I'll do a blog post. So you'll have all this later. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but you'll be able to reference all this stuff later. All right. So then, now that I have a user class, I can change my credit card class to have a one-to-many with my user class, which makes sense. Now I have ownership there, and I can do the stuff that I was talking about in the previous test. And I also switched to using bcrypt. Now, I talked about this earlier. I'm using reject if no rule. Now, that's the pessimistic approach where if you haven't configured access to something, you get denied access to it. You have to, if everyone can see something, you have to say everyone can see this. So what that means is that you have to do stuff like in config.groovy, you actually have to give permission to see the favicon and your CSS and your and I haven't done that yet. So this actually will break. When I try to, if I try to go to my login GSP, my login controller, it'll fail because I haven't allowed access to it. So if I try to go to something that's guarded, I could, depending on how it's configured, I could either get into an infinite loop or have it just fail. So this is misconfigured at this point. So reject if no rule isn't enough. You have to then open things up. I also created the book service and the book ACL service. So now I've installed the functional test plugin, and now let's actually look in a little bit more detail at what's going on here. So I have a controller. I created a scaffolded controller using static scaffolding. So I ran Grails generate controller book. So I created the scaffolded GSPs, just all the CRUD actions, standard stuff. I'm not going to show you that. But what I'll show you is the refactored version that uses services. So now, instead of getting all of the books that were requested, I use bookservice.list. This is ACL guarded. The save method there's no persistence in the controller, which is, forget about security. You shouldn't be doing any persistence in the controllers, right? Because it's not transactional. Controllers are not transactional. If you do multiple things and something fails in between and you flush, then you'll be inconsistent. Classic stuff. If you want to do several things at once, you want to either have them all succeed or all fail. So you should refactor all of your code with or without security. You can do reads in your controllers, but you should do all of your writes in a service. So that's been done, and in addition, it has been refactored to use security. So, so this is a very lean controller because it doesn't have much logic in it anymore because all of that has been pushed into the service. So if I look at book service now, I have it specifically annotated as @transactional so that I can have some methods that are transactional and some that aren't. So for example, since this one isn't annotated as @transactional, it's not. You don't need a transaction around a get. But you do want a transaction around a save like this. So this has two annotations. It's transactional, and it has an ACL check that says you have to have the user role in order to create a book. So it'll do the same thing you would have done. It'll create the book, and then if it saves correctly without any validation errors, then, and you have to do a little stuff here. You can only grant permissions as an admin, so it temporarily logs in as an admin user using do with auth, and then grants a permission, and then it backs back up to the previous user. It's all in the same thread, so there's no thread safety concerns here. Now, and it returns the book. And so if it didn't save, then it'll return the book, and it'll have errors attached, and you can show the failure page saying, you know, you didn't specify a title or whatever. If it does, if you did have permission and it saved correctly, then you'll have a persistent book returned, and you can then go to the show page, right? Standard stuff. So the get action is guarded with a read ACL. So only users who have been granted the read permission on that for that ID can see this. This would make more sense for the credit card, but you can guard anything like this. Now notice up here that I used the pre-authorize, but down here I'm using both pre-authorize and post-filter. So this is checking before this runs, do you have role user? And it also then checks the whole list, and it'll filter any books out of the list that you don't have read permission for. This causes some weird behaviors in the ACL world, because what will happen is it would be programmatically really difficult to figure out. Let me back up a little bit. When you're doing pagination, right? You've got 110 books, and you want to show pages of 10, so there's going to be 11 pages, and you have the links, right? Standard Grails stuff. It'll generate all that for you. You can know that of the books that you requested, which ones you can see, and you can get that sublist. But it would be really hard to join into the ACL tables and the book table, or the ACL tables and the credit card table, the ACL tables and the whatever table, to figure out what's the total count of things that you can see. That makes sense? So your pagination will be wrong, because it'll say you've got 110 total, but you'll only end up on page 6, and then page 7 will be empty, and page 8 will be empty, and page 9 will be empty. And I thought a lot about this problem. I do not know how to solve it without doing joins into these tables, and you really don't want to do that. That's really messy stuff. Gorm doesn't handle it. I asked the Spring Security guys, the real Spring Security guys, the people who actually wrote Spring Security. They didn't know. They had never even thought about it and had nothing to help me. So again, if any of you have come up with a solution to this problem, I think the real solution is you have to switch to, you have to join to your permissions tables, and that's just bad. That would not perform. So pagination doesn't work well with this sort of an approach. So count, I guess that doesn't really need any permissions or security or transactionality, so that's a bare method. And I commented this out because, and I'm not going to go into the details of the ACL plugin, but these two are equivalent. This has been defined on the book class using an ACL voter configuration. So you can either use this or this. They're both basically the same. I did basically the same thing for the credit card service, but I don't have a generated controller for this. This is a little bit different though, because here I use, I'm really stacking my annotations here. So now I'm using actually 3 annotations here, and I'm combining, this is transactional, and you have to be an admin to delete a credit card, and you have to have the permission to delete credit cards. So this is sort of a fine-grained, so within the admin, some admins might not have permission to delete. So this is actually a Shiro annotation. And the one above it is Spring Security. So I've actually got 3 proxies around this method. There's a transactional proxy, a Spring Security proxy, and a Shiro proxy. They will not necessarily be in the order that I defined them. It doesn't really matter. As long as they all fire and they all allow the access, then we're good. So this is actually a Frankenstein monster application where I'm mixing Shiro and Spring Security, and it could explode at any moment. So wear safety glasses. All right, so there's that. And then all right. So I want to actually start looking at functional testing. So let me look at a couple more classes. I've set up some URL mappings for convenience here. So I'm routing errors through a controller. I think that's a good idea in general, because it allows you, instead of routing just to a GSP, you can do some logic, you can do some logging or anything you want. So it's not there's no real performance concern or anything. So this just shows the GSP right now. I could do some logic. The 404 does a print line. That should actually be a log debug. And then this just renders 0 page. And this is open, right? I've allowed access to anyone to this page. So this is the sort of thing you need to do. You need to grant access to all your controllers. So you need to also do that for your login controller and your logout controller. So these are generated by Spring Security, but these are not annotated this way because it doesn't know whether you're using annotations or request maps or whatever. So this is something you'd have to do yourself. I've also got some bootstrap data there for some test users. All right. Oh, and I created a little, if I wanted to right now, I'm a little tight on time, but I created a really quick little secure controller. Because before testing my full controllers, I want to do just a sort of a really lightweight, simple test, right? So a real dumb controller that has an action that anyone can get to, an action that a user can get to, and an action that an admin can get to. So this is the sort of thing I would do very early on, just when I wanted to kind of see that the testing works, see that I understand what's even going on. So I write a little, real basic unit test. First test, just see that I can get the secure index action and that it rendered that, and that it didn't get redirected to the login page, I didn't get an error or anything like that. So this extends a base class of mine that extends the functional test case from the plugin that has a whole bunch of stuff. So every time you run a method, you log out, because it's whether you logged in or logged out, it's always going to call the logout, so that you're clean in between every run, right? And it's got a whole bunch of utility methods that I've used for to make things easier for me, to keep my tests clean. This is how you submit forms. You just have a closure with you call the form method, you pass the closure, and then you set the field values to whatever they need to be, and you click the button, and it submits that request and logs in. So, all right, so let me fast forward a bit. So I'm done. I'm at the latest version. Everything's complete. So this I fleshed out. I had originally created a test just for the index action. Now I'm creating a user test. So I try to get the secure action. I assert that I've been bounced to the login page and that the page contains at least this phrase. Then I log in and then I get it again and I see that I get whatever. Really basic stuff. And this is very easy to automate. You could script a lot of this stuff. If you run that thing that I showed you before, where you find out all your controller actions, you could probably have a data-based test. You could probably do this with Spock, where you literally read some sort of data, like a data table like Spock has, or CSV file, or even from the database, and you could have a test that just, given this URL, prove that it requires user, right? So you run 57 of these and 100 of these, and so you could do the bulk of your security testing just in an automated way. And then the stuff that actually requires thinking, you could actually do as proper methods. So at this point, my Bootstrap has a whole bunch of stuff in there. I'm creating users, and I'm creating books, and I'm granting ACL permissions, and I'm creating credit cards, and I'm granting Shiro permissions. So credit card view, credit card create, credit card update. And I've also got the fully fleshed out functional tests. So I've got book controller tests. I haven't generated a credit card controller yet, so I have no credit card tests, but it would be basically the same thing. So I test list as user one, and I have some notes up here to remind me what I granted. So user one can only see the first 67 books, so it should be missing 33 of them. So I'll actually do a test to see that I can see those 7, but I can't see the rest. And the whole next page is blank. So this literally does 10, 17, 20, 30, about 30 requests. This will do 30 gets programmatically for me in one test method. No, it won't. I'm sorry. This is going to be a page and it's going to do all these asserts. But you could loop through and do a whole bunch of gets and posts and whatever. So testing list as an admin, I should be able to see all 100. So I get all 100 in one page, and then I just assert that the content views those and test whether I can save as a user, and so a bunch of different combinations, because user 1 and user 2 have different permissions. The admin can do anything, and so pretty much just kind of running through all the different variants of can I save, can I delete, can I view, can I do different things as different users, and make sure that the admin can always pretty much do everything. Now I promised that we could do some stuff with integration tests, and we can. So, I'm doing ACL testing here. So I've dependency injected in the book service and the ACL service and all that stuff in the base class. So I can log in as an admin before I do everything here, and then I check to see that I can call those service methods. So these aren't functional tests now, these are integration tests. These are calling service methods that are wrapped in a proxy that are going to get intercepted and bounced. And these are very similar to the web requests on the controllers. In fact, they're kind of redundant. You can do both, or you can just do one. I think if you're going to do just one, you're probably going to want to go with the functional tests, because that's going to be more full stack. They're slower but safer. More likely to catch something that you missed. Because if you sneak in underneath something, then there's a chance that you'll miss something. So I've got credit card service tests, which do the ACL stuff for that. And then tests as user 1 and user 2. And then here's the configuration tests. This is pretty big. So this basically goes through and it just checks a handful of properties. You can check as many as make sense, but I want to assert that that Spring Security is enabled, right? That's something that you should probably have as part of everything you do. Make sure that security is running by default. The ACL plugin is disableable, and the core plugin can be disabled, Shiro can be disabled. Assert that they're all active. Assert that we're not caching users. Assert that that reject if no rule is true. Check the class names. Now I can look at the configured URL mappings. Remember, there are 3 ways in Spring Security to set this up. The default is annotations, and that's what I'm using here. But you can also put you can use a domain class for that. You can have a request map domain class. And you can also have just a big map, just a big string, which is URL pattern colon role pattern, URL pattern, role pattern. Whichever way you use, the underlying data that Spring Security needs is exposed here. So this isn't a annotation test or a request map test. This works no matter what security setup you use. And it should find all of the stuff. And in fact, this stuff right here, the CSS and favicon, that was set up in that map in the config.groovy. So whereas the other ones are based on annotations. So check that I'm using annotations, right? So if that changes, I might need to change stuff. I didn't talk about this, but I configured basic authentication, although I'm not actually using it. So if you look in config.groovy, I did a thing that Spring Security plugin lets you do, which is have some patterns, some URL patterns in your application use basic authentication, and the rest not. So the only reason I did that was so that I could test it, because I wanted 2 different filter chains. You can actually have, by default, you usually just have the one, but you can have as many as you want. So this way I check that I have 2 filter chains, and I actually check that, assert that this filter is in this position, and that there are 10 of them in this chain, and that there are only 9 of them in this chain, and I have these in this order. So this is the sort of thing you would just write once and tweak as needed, and you wouldn't maintain this much. This probably wouldn't grow all that much. I can delete that, I guess. Check my logout, handlers, my voters, and pretty much anything. I mean, anything that's there that is configurable, you can set. So this is pretty much a relatively static test that would kind of, you just write it once and then update it as you need. The other stuff would kind of grow as your application grows. As you add in more functionality, you guard more URLs, you're going to write more tests for them. You'll find them by you rerunning that little script that I had that'll find the actions, and then you need to have some sort of a process that cross-references what you are currently testing versus what is open, and you need to then find gaps. I don't know if there's a good way to kind of automate that. But anyway, so does this make sense? Is this the sort of thing you guys are currently doing? Is anyone testing security right now? I am scared to death that I see no hands going up. Someone is testing security. You get the gold star. All right, but I saw other hands. Now, I only saw a few hands for Spring Security. Who is using some sort of a any security at all? Who has a secured application in any way? Either Shiro or Spring Security or SiteMinder or something you did yourself? And you're not testing your security. What's wrong with you people? Okay, so start doing this stuff. And so you can't tell me anything because you don't know, because you don't test this stuff. So when you start doing this stuff, let me know how it goes, right? I want to maintain sort of a knowledge base. I want to keep doing this talk and also maybe document this as part of the documentation, because I don't have a section of the Spring Security documentation on testing it. Because this is really the first time I've thought about testing it from a client point of view, from an application point of view. So I'd like to have a good document, a good chapter or two in the docs on that. Docs are pretty long right now. They're about 80 pages, but more docs is always good, right? All right. So any questions about this? Does this all sort of make sense? Sort of. Like I said, I will. You guys know about This Week in Grails, my blog series that I do. Used to be translated into Spanish, and it's not anymore. So if anybody wants to translate this into Spanish, that would be super awesome. See me if you want to do that. Basically, it's a list of jobs and tweets and blog posts and stuff that I find that I think is interesting, and it comes out every week. And you can check out. It has an RSS feed, and I always tweet about it. So I will do a blog post on this, and then I will add that to that listing. So your best bet is actually to make my homepage, burtbeckwith.com/blog. Make that your homepage on your browser, and then when that post is available, you'll see that. But I'll write this up pretty soon. I'll make the code available, make the presentation available on SlideShare, although there wasn't much in the presentation. And you can start using this stuff. And please secure your apps and test your security. Okay, thank you.